So, what did the map of the United States look like before 1803?
When from 1776 to 1803, America had 13 colonies when it declared independence from the British.
What was west of the 13 colonies?
West of the 13 colonies was the Ohio Territory.
What should people know about the Ohio Territory?
During the Revolutionary War, Ohio was made up of a few settlers who lived in the woods. Ohio was a neutral territory with a few settlers in the woods and Native Americans that controlled it. George Washington knew about it and allowed Native Americans to keep the territory. George Washington allowed this because Native Americans helped him in the French and Indian War, also called in Europe the 13 Years' War.
Other than the 13 colonies, who controlled North America?
The 13 colonies went from Massachusetts, that was later separated into Massachusetts and Maine, because before the Civil War, so that way Massachusetts could have slaves and Maine could be a free state. That went all the way down to Georgia. The 13 colonies controlled everything from Massachusetts to Georgia.
Who controlled the land west of Georgia?
West of Georgia was controlled by the French until the Spanish acquired it. The French also controlled Quebec in Canada. The Spanish controlled Florida, Mexico, and California.
Who was the president in 1803?
Thomas Jefferson was the president in 1803.
What was the political party Thomas Jefferson was affiliated with?
Thomas Jefferson was the founder of the Democrat Republican Party and Secretary of State under George Washington, who was a Federalist.
Why did Thomas Jefferson want to move the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C.?
Thomas Jefferson wanted to move the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. because at the time, most Americans lived in rural areas, and he felt that it would be more representative of the American people to have the capital in a rural area. They felt underrepresented, and Thomas Jefferson was their voice. This is how Thomas Jefferson got elected.
Why was the westward expansion so important to the Democrat Republican Party and Jefferson administration?
Thomas Jefferson was idealistic about the American people, and he believed that America would be stronger if the territory was included, was expanded. If the territory was expanded for the American people, because that way it would be stronger and there would be more places to farm, and it would help pay off debt for the American Revolution.
What was the Louisiana Purchase?
Louisiana Purchase was a territory that consisted of the western part of the United States, west of Ohio. So that way, that was purchased from the Spanish.
What happened to the people already living on the land?
What Thomas Jefferson didn't take into account was the people that lived in the territory who now lived under a new government. The two people most affected by this were Creoles in Creoles in Louisiana and Native Americans in Wyoming.
Who are the Creoles?
The Creoles are mixed race, half French, half Native Caribbean, and their language is a mixture of French and Native Caribbean.
How did the Creoles affect slavery in America?
Although Louisiana was a slave state, the slave trade did not affect the Creoles. Even though the Creoles could have been slaves who were descendant of Haitians who fought in the Haitian Revolution, they were not slaves. The French granted them their freedom, and they had enough status in New Orleans to create the first black middle class in this country, despite New Orleans being a slave port.
What were the cultural differences between the Native Americans in 13 colonies and the Midwestern Native Americans Lewis and Clark crossed paths with on their journey?
The Native Americans in the East Coast generally got along with the Americans during the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War. The Native Americans were different in the plains because they were considered to be a barrier to Western expansion. The Native Americans were considered to be a barrier to Western expansion, which led to the president Andrew Jackson, who was founder of the Democratic Party that was founded on racism, as opposed to the Republican Party that was founded to abolish slavery under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. With Andrew Jackson committing genocide against the Native Americans in the Cherokee Trail of Tears, where he went in there to depopulate the territory. He killed Native Americans in cold blood, just so that way they would not be a barrier to Western expansion. This eventually led to Native Americans from all over the country being forced onto reservations. What was the biological effect of having all the buffaloes killed so that way people can making it possible for Americans to develop the cattle industry in Texas?
So, in nature, living things are dependent on each other for food. Animals eat other animals to survive, so when the buffalo were killed off, the other animals, like wolves that ate the buffalo, also died. Since buffalo ate certain plants, once the buffalo were gone, some plants were growing out of control, and Native Americans who used the buffalo as food and clothing resources lost their food source and a source of how they made clothing and shelter because they used the buffalo skins for these resources to stay alive in cold weather. Who were Lewis and Clark?
Meriwether Lewis was a personal chief of staff and secretary to Thomas Jefferson. Who Thomas Jefferson asked to survey trade routes to the Pacific Ocean. William Clark was Meriwether Lewis' superior when he was in the Army, who Meriwether Lewis brought onto the expedition.
How were slaves managed in 1803?
Slaves were generally held by their masters. However, when their master would travel, the slave would go with them to help the master with particularly manual labor, whether it be cooking for female slaves or carrying things for male slaves.
Who is York?
York was a personal slave to William Clark, who he was ordered by to join the expedition to help out William Clark. He helped with physical tasks on the journey. What were the different ecosystems that Lewis and Clark had discovered?
Lewis and Clark discovered many animals such as beavers, coyotes, prairie dogs, grizzly bears, and jackrabbits. They discovered rivers like the Missouri River.
How did climate affect Lewis and Clark on their journey?
Lewis and Clark experienced a cold climate that they were not used to. A lot of the expedition happened during winter. York's friend Charles Floyd probably died of something called hypothermia. Humans have a certain body temperature that is healthy for us, but if the body temperature is too low, it can harm the body and cause death. Dylan, who was Sacagawea?
Sacagawea was a part of the Shoshone tribe that served as a guide to Lewis and Clark during the expedition, who happened to be a nursing mother at the time.
What does Sacagawea teach us about motherhood?
The history of Sacagawea shows us that you can care for a child and travel at the same time. And she teaches us that being a mother enriches your life and does not stop your life. Sacagawea teaches us that you can go anywhere and still take care of your child. Sacagawea shows us that you can be empowered and take care of your child and be proud of your femininity. What does Sacagawea teach you as a woman?
Sacagawea teaches me that women can be resilient and endure a lot of hardships while caring for their children. Who did Lewis and Clark find in Oregon?
They found the British, who were using the territory of Oregon to hunt beaver, which became Oregon and Washington State just before the Civil War. So that way, Oregon can be a free state and Washington could be a slave state. When Thomas Jefferson found out that the British were in Oregon, he bought the Oregon Territory from the British.
What did the expedition lead to?
The expedition of Lewis and Clark led to the settling of the West, and they became national heroes who stood for the promise of America and a sense of national pride. In the same way that John F. Kennedy inspired the nation with the space race, and Donald Trump inspired the nation with Project Warp Speed to develop the COVID vaccine. What did Thomas
Jefferson administration do with the land they acquired in the Louisiana Purchase?
Thomas Jefferson believed that the land belonged to the American people, so he gave the land to the people. He gave it to them for free for them to start farms and pay taxes back to the government. This was called manifest destiny. Thomas Jefferson captured the country with optimism, which captured the hearts and minds of the American people.
Who are the pioneers?
The pioneers were people who took Thomas Jefferson up on his offer. A lot of people were low income and needed more room for their families. One of the most famous pioneers was the family of Abraham Lincoln, whose family were pioneers who immigrated to Indiana, our 16th president and founder of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin. A good depiction of pioneer life was the show Little House on the Prairie, which took place in the Midwest states, Wisconsin, Kansas, and Minnesota.
What is the legacy of Manifest Destiny?
The legacy of Manifest Destiny is that America is a place to take risks. It's the legacy of the American West that makes us dream of America as the land of opportunity. This is what it means to be unified under a single vision, which is what Thomas Jefferson set out to do.
What are some misconceptions of westward expansion?
Biggest misconception is that the Americans stole the land. But this could not be further from the truth, because Thomas Jefferson made a clean transaction with the Spaniards. Thomas Jefferson was also unaware of the Native Americans who were living there. The mistreatment of Native Americans started under Andrew Jackson, who founded the Democratic Party, for racist reasons.
What does it mean to take risks?
Taking risks is an essential part of being an American. What makes our country exceptional is that Lois and Clark was willing to take the risk. The legacy of Manifest Destiny teaches us we can do anything we put our mind to as a country.
What accommodations do you use to take risks, Dylan?
When I moved to Florida, it was far less risky to move to the Panhandle before going to South Florida. When I first got to Florida, I almost became homeless because I came from a broken home and only had $1,200 to my name. And yet settled in Florida despite all odds to get what I need as a disabled person. What accommodations did you use to take risks, Margot?
I took a risk to move to the Southwest to be closer to one side of my family. We moved to the state of New Mexico, where I lived for 3 years and made many friendships. I accommodated myself by planning ahead for the move and making sure my new home and new school had things like ramps. 3 years later, I moved back to Brooklyn, but my friends in New Mexico stayed friends with me and hired me as a board member of their theater called Teatro Paraguas, where I still work. Have you ever lived out west before, Dylan?
When I was living in Queens, the program that I was on for disabled people tried to kick me out by saying, you either sign your life over to us or we'll cut your housing funding. I refused to sign over my life to the state, to the disabled program I was living under. So I looked to the West, as Robert Plant would say, in Stairway to Heaven. I decided to take the same path as the great Jewish immigrant and American entrepreneur Levi Strauss, who created blue jeans. As in the tradition of westward expansion, I moved to Texas. In the tradition of westward expansion, I moved to Texas as an independent disabled adult to get away from the disability system that was holding me back, and I succeeded. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking the ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, and down below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, and I followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands her diamond deserts. And all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling in the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling. The voice was chanting, and the fog was lifted. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to New York Island. From the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. When the sun comes shining, then I was strolling in the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling. The voice was chanting, and the fog was lifted. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you